Big Shaq's mom pulled into the dealership, expecting to be treated like any other customer. But salesman saw an old car and made a decision. Big Shaq's mom wasn't worth their time. Laughed, ignored, dismissed. What they didn't know? Big Shaq was watching. And now, the entire dealership is about to learn a lesson they'll never forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had everything a man could want: money, fame, success, but none of it changed who he was at his core. He had been raised by a woman who taught him that true wealth wasn't in the bank, but in the way you treated people. And so, even as a millionaire, Shaq never forgot where he came from. The morning sun cast a soft glow over Atlanta, stretching across the skyline as Shaq pulled into his favorite local breakfast diner, not a high-end five-star restaurant, but a small family-owned spot where the coffee was strong, the biscuits were homemade, and the people treated him like one of their own. Inside, the scent of bacon, grits, and fresh biscuits filled the air, mixing with the sound of quiet conversations and the occasional sizzle from the open kitchen. The moment Shaq stepped in, heads turned. Not because he was Shaquille O'Neal, the NBA legend, but because he was Big Shaq, the regular. "Morning, big guy," shouted Henry, the owner, wiping his hands on his apron. Shaq grinned, squeezing into a booth that barely fit his frame. "Morning, old man. Hope y'all saved me some biscuits." Henry chuckled. "You know I got you covered." The waitress, a young single mom named Lisa, poured his coffee without asking. She didn't treat him like a celebrity. She treated him like family. And Shaq liked it that way. This was his routine. He came here not just for the food, but for the people. For the chance to help without making a scene. At the end of his meal, he always did the same thing. Left a $500 tip under his plate, slipped another envelope of cash to Henry for the light bill, and quietly covered the bill for the next few tables. Never for attention. Never for a thank you. Just because he could. And as he walked out, he saw Lisa pick up the tip, her eyes widening as she tried to hold back emotion. She didn't chase after him. She didn't have to. Shaq never looked back when he gave, because giving wasn't about being seen. Later that afternoon, Shaq pulled into a quiet neighborhood, the kind most people never visited unless they had a reason to. He had a reason. Every month he came back to his old stomping grounds, checking in on families struggling to make ends meet, paying off grocery store bills, surprising kids with brand new sneakers, and making sure no one in his city went without. A little girl, no older than 7, ran up to him as he stepped out of his car. "Shaq, you came back," she shouted, wrapping her small arms around his leg. Shaq laughed, lifting her easily with one arm. "Of course I did," he said. "Had to make sure y'all behaving." Her mother, standing on the porch, wiped a tear from her eye as she watched. Because Shaq didn't just write checks. He showed up. He made people feel seen. But for all the good he did for the world, there was one person he owed everything to. Lucille O'Neal. His mother. His rock. She had raised him with discipline, with faith, with the kind of love that never let him get too big for his own good. And despite all his wealth, all his success, she never let it change who she was either. She still lived simply, dressed modestly, and drove the same car she'd had for years. Not because she couldn't afford better, but because she never needed more than enough. "Boy, don't you go wasting money on me," she'd always say. "I got everything I need." Shaq had tried to buy her a mansion, but she was happier in her quiet home. Tried to get her a brand new luxury car, but she loved her old, well-maintained sedan. "It gets me where I need to go," she'd say. She wasn't impressed by flashy things. She was impressed by how her son carried himself. And that was worth more than all the money in the world. That evening, Shaq met Lucille for dinner at a small, cozy restaurant, where they always sat in the corner booth, catching up like they did every week. Lucille, dressed in a simple but elegant brown coat, sipped her tea slowly. Always poised, always dignified. Shaq watched her, knowing something most people didn't. That even in her quiet strength, she had lived through a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed, judged by those who only saw her from the outside. He had seen it firsthand, the way some people looked at her when they didn't know who she was. Because in certain places, wealth wasn't just about money. It was about appearance, about who they thought deserved luxury and who didn't. And Shaq knew, deep in his gut, that someday soon, the world was going to remind her of that reality again. But what? They didn't know. He was always watching. And this time, they were about to learn the hard way. Lucille O'Neill had never been one to ask for more than she needed. Her old silver sedan, a car she had driven for years, still ran smoothly. It wasn't the flashiest thing on the road, but it was reliable, dependable, like her. But lately the engine had been making a strange noise, and though she didn't like spending money unnecessarily, she figured it was time to at least look at her options, not for luxury, not for status, just for something practical. So that morning, she grabbed her purse, slipped on her simple brown coat, and headed out. She had no idea that by the time she left that dealership, she would be a different kind of customer in their eyes. But by then, it would be too late. Lucille pulled into the lot of Sterling Auto Group, a well-known luxury dealership in one of Atlanta's wealthiest districts. The showroom's glass walls gleamed under the midday sun, reflecting rows of sleek, high-end cars parked out front. Machines designed not just for driving, but for being seen. As she turned into the lot, she noticed them immediately. The salesmen. 3 of them standing near the entrance, dressed in crisp suits, laughing among themselves. Until they saw her car. Lucille had seen that look before. The subtle shift in posture, the quiet exchange of glances, the barely there smirks. They didn't think she noticed, but she did. It wasn't hostility. It was something else. Something quieter. Dismissal. She had barely put the car in park before the youngest of the 3, a slim man in a navy blue suit with an overconfident smirk, leaned toward his colleague and said something under his breath. The second man, a redhead with a too-tight tie, let out a chuckle. Lucille couldn't hear them. She didn't need to. She already knew. By the time she stepped out of the car, the tone had already been set. She closed the door gently, adjusting the strap of her purse over her shoulder, then took a slow glance around the lot. The men at the entrance? They didn't move. They didn't rush over like they had for the well-dressed couple that arrived in a black Mercedes minutes earlier. They just watched, waiting, as if expecting her to turn toward the used car section on her own. She didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked straight for the showroom. If they were expecting her to shrink herself, they were about to be disappointed. Inside, the dealership was all shiny floors, polished chrome, and the scent of fresh leather. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, glanced up from her computer, her smile polite but not particularly warm. "Welcome to Sterling Auto," she said. "Can I help you?" Lucille returned the smile, just as polite. "Yes, I'd like to take a look at some of your SUVs. Something with good safety ratings and a smooth drive." The receptionist hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Of course," she said quickly, then turned toward the sales floor. Lucille followed her gaze. There were 5 salespeople on the floor, each engaged in lively conversations with customers, all of whom looked the part of high-end buyers. And yet, despite the fact that Lucille was standing right there, ready to buy, not a single one of them stepped forward. The receptionist glanced back at her screen. "I'll get someone for you," she said. Lucille nodded, but she already knew what was happening. They were waiting to see if she was really worth their time. It took nearly 3 minutes for a salesman to approach, and when he did, it wasn't with enthusiasm. "Good afternoon," he said, forcing a thin smile. "Are you looking for something specific?" Lucille recognized him from outside, the redhead with the too-tight tie. His name tag read, Connor. "Yes," she said smoothly. "I'd like to take a look at your SUV models, preferably something newer, with a smooth ride." Connor nodded, but his eyes drifted toward the glass doors, where Lucille's old sedan sat among the lineup of luxury cars. And just like that, his demeanor shifted. His smile became strained, his tone just a little too rehearsed. "I see," he said. "Well, we have a few models that might be a good fit. Our pre-owned section is right this way." Lucille didn't blink. I'm interested in your new models, she said, cutting him off. Connor hesitated, as if processing the idea that she wasn't here to haggle over used inventory. Then, reluctantly, he gestured toward the showroom floor. Right this way, ma'am. Lucille followed him to a sleek black SUV, its polished exterior gleaming under the showroom lights. She placed a hand on the door, running her fingers lightly over the handle. Tell me about this one, she said. Connor nodded quickly. This is one of our top models, fully loaded, top-tier safety features, smooth handling. He paused, glancing at her. It's on the higher end of our pricing, though. Lucille turned her head slightly. A test. That's what this was. A quiet, subtle test to see if she would flinch at the price before he even said it. She didn't. She just nodded. And the warranty? She asked smoothly. Connor cleared his throat. It comes with a 5-year warranty, but most customers who finance prefer to extend it. Lucille arched an eyebrow. Who said anything about financing? Connor blinked, the first crack in his carefully controlled expression. Oh, he stammered. Well, I just assumed. He caught himself. But it was too late. Lucille O'Neill had already seen enough. She let the silence stretch, letting him feel it. Then finally she exhaled, stepping back from the SUV. Thank you for your time, she said, voice even. Connor's forehead creased. Would you like to discuss pricing? No need, she said. Then with the same quiet dignity she had walked in with, she turned toward the exit. She could feel the weight of eyes on her as she walked out. Not just Connor's, but the receptionists, the other salespeople's, even the wealthy couple from earlier, now watching from the showroom floor. She kept her posture straight, her steps steady, because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her frustration. But deep down, she felt something colder than anger. She felt tired. Because after all these years, all the progress, all the money her son had earned, they still saw her as someone who didn't belong. And that hurt more than anything. Outside, she climbed back into her old sedan, gripping the wheel as she sat in silence for a moment. Then, exhaling slowly, she put the car in reverse. As she pulled out of the lot, she didn't notice the black SUV parked near the corner, its tinted windows hiding the man inside. A man who had been there the entire time, watching, listening. And now, planning his next move. Lucille O'Neill had been disregarded before. She had lived long enough to know that in certain spaces, wealth wasn't just about money, it was about appearances. And right now, standing in the middle of Sterling Auto Group's showroom, she knew exactly what they thought of her. But if they believed she would shrink under their assumptions, they had the wrong woman. Connor, the red-haired salesman, had barely masked his disinterest when he first approached her. The moment she mentioned wanting to browse new SUVs, his smile had tightened. It was a look she knew well, one that said, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" And instead of leading her toward the luxury models displayed under the best showroom lights, he gestured toward the far end of the dealership, where the used cars were lined up. "We have some great pre-owned options over here," he said, already walking, expecting her to follow. Lucille didn't move. "I asked about your new models," she said evenly. Connor hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the entrance, as if silently hoping another more suitable customer would walk in and save him from this conversation. But when no one did, he forced a laugh. "Of course," he said, as if humoring a child who didn't understand the cost of what they were asking for. "Right this way." As they walked toward a sleek black luxury SUV, Lucille could feel it. The watching eyes. Employees at the front desk whispering behind their computer screens. Another salesman, a tall blonde man near the finance office, giving Connor a look that clearly said, "What are you wasting time doing?" She ignored it all. She had spent a lifetime walking through doors where people silently questioned if she belonged, and she always proved them wrong. Connor stopped beside the SUV, placing a practiced hand on the roof, the way salesmen do when they want to establish dominance over the sale. "This one's fully loaded," he said. "Luxury leather seats, built-in navigation, top-tier safety features." Lucille ran her fingers over the handle, testing the weight of the door before meeting his gaze. "And the price?" she asked. Connor hesitated for just a second too long. Then he forced another smile. "It's on the higher end of our pricing," he said. Lucille kept her expression neutral. "And?" Connor shifted his weight. "Well, most of our customers finance this kind of model," he added, his tone carefully measured. Lucille exhaled slowly through her nose. There it was. He had already decided. She wasn't a buyer. She was a browser, a waste of time. Before she could respond, the showroom doors swung open and a young couple walked in. They were exactly the kind of customers the dealership wanted. A man in a tailored suit, a woman in heels that clicked against the tile, carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than a car payment. Connor straightened. His whole energy shifted in an instant. His posture snapped to attention, his shoulders squared, and his polite but distant expression transformed into eager enthusiasm. "Excuse me for 1 second, he told Lucille, already moving toward them before she could answer. She watched, unimpressed, as Connor rushed forward, his voice warmer, smoother, livelier. "Welcome to Sterling Auto. What brings you in today?" The woman barely acknowledged him, glancing at her freshly manicured nails, while the man scanned the showroom. "We're looking for something top tier," the man said, tossing his car keys in his hand like it was a habit. Lucille noticed the brand, Porsche. Connor's grin widened. "Absolutely," he said, already leading them toward the exact model Lucille had been asking about. He didn't hesitate to offer them champagne, to open the doors, to show them every feature with excitement. For them, there was no mention of pre-owned options, no assumption that they would need to finance, no hesitation in treating them like serious buyers. Lucille stood in silence. She had already been dismissed, forgotten, as if she had never existed in the first place. She turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the receptionist at the front desk. The young woman had been watching the whole thing unfold, her expression somewhere between awkward and unsurprised. And then, Lucille heard it, the low chuckle. She didn't turn immediately, but she listened. "You see that?" one of the salesmen muttered, just loud enough for his colleague to hear but assuming Lucille couldn't. "Yeah," the other replied. What was she thinking? Pulling up in that grandma sedan and asking about an SUV? She probably just wanted to take pictures and waste time. Lucille's grip on her purse tightened slightly. She felt the words settle into her chest. Not because they hurt, but because they were so expected. She had been judged before she even stepped out of the car. And now, they weren't even bothering to hide it. She turned then, slowly. And when she did, the salesman who had spoken froze mid-laugh. Lucille met his eyes, held them, and watched as the color drained from his face. For the first time, he realized she had heard every word. The other man nudged him, mumbling something under his breath, and both quickly turned away, pretending to be busy. Lucille let them. She said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She had seen who they were. And soon, they were going to see who she was too. Taking one last look at Connor, still schmoozing the young couple like they were royalty, she exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Not angry, not embarrassed, but I was disappointed, because no matter how much money her son had, no matter how many millions sat in their family's accounts, there were still places where people like her would never be seen as worthy. And that was the real shame. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she reached for her car keys, pausing for a brief moment before unlocking the door. Her old sedan sat between two high-end sports cars, its clean but aging exterior a stark contrast to the sleek machines beside it. She could already picture Connor and his co-workers laughing about it the second she drove away. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that someone else had been watching, someone who had seen everything. And unlike them, he knew exactly who she was. Shaquille O'Neal had never been a man who needed to announce his presence. When he walked into a room, people noticed, but only if he wanted them to. And today, at Sterling Auto Group, he had chosen to be invisible. He had come in for something simple. His custom Escalade was in the service center for a routine checkup. The dealership had directed him to their VIP lounge, a sleek, modern space tucked away in the corner of the showroom. It was meant to be a quiet place for high-profile clients, where they could sip complimentary espresso, browse luxury car catalogs, and avoid the usual sales floor chaos. But Shaq? He wasn't looking at brochures. He was watching. And what he saw didn't sit right. From his seat, he had a perfect view of the main showroom. He had seen the way his mother's old silver sedan pulled into the lot, a car he had offered to replace a dozen times, but she always waved him off, saying, "It runs just fine." He had seen the way the salesman at the entrance exchanged looks the second she stepped out. And then, he had watched it all unfold. The hesitation, the forced politeness, the way they steered her away from the luxury models, assuming, no, deciding, that she didn't belong there. And worst of all, he had watched his mother, a woman who deserved the world, be treated like nothing. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his massive frame impossibly still, his face unreadable. But inside something burned. Not just anger. Shaq had learned a long time ago that anger didn't solve things. No, this was something colder, something calculated. Because Shaq had power. Not just the kind that came from money or fame, but the kind that came from knowing exactly when to strike. And this wasn't over. He continued watching as his mother stood beside the black luxury SUV, running her fingers along the handle, asking about the price. He saw the salesman, Connor, hesitate, just for a second, before he gave her the same tired line they used on customers they didn't take seriously. "Well, most of our buyers prefer to finance." Shaq clenched his jaw, but his expression didn't change. He watched as his mother didn't flinch, didn't get angry, didn't let them see how insulting it was, because she had been through this before, too many times. And that hurt Shaq more than anything. The fact that his mother had learned how to swallow this kind of treatment, because the world had forced her to. Then came the final blow. The moment Connor abandoned her mid-sale, the second, a wealthy-looking couple walked through the door. Shaq didn't miss how Connor's posture changed immediately, how the bored indifference disappeared, replaced by the energy of a man who had suddenly found a real customer. He watched as Lucille stood there, waiting, invisible. She didn't say anything. She didn't fight for attention. She just let the moment speak for itself. And when she finally turned to leave, Shaq saw the shift in her shoulders, the one so small, so subtle, that only someone who knew her well would recognize it. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She was just tired. And that was what broke him. Shaq's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair, slow and deliberate. He could feel the weight of his own patience slipping. He had been quiet long enough. He could stand up right now, walk across the showroom, say just one sentence. "Why are y'all treating my mother like this?" And watch everything crumble in real time. But no, that was too easy. He wasn't going to give them the quick, dramatic out. He wasn't going to let them scramble for excuses and apologies, try to save themselves with empty discounts and fake smiles. No, Shaq was going to handle this his way. And his way was going to make sure they never forgot it. He watched as Lucille walked through the glass doors, stepping back into the sunlight, reaching for her car keys. He saw the way the salesman near the front desk chuckled, glancing out the window, probably making another joke about her driving away in that grandma sedan. They thought it was funny. Shaq didn't, because what they didn't know, what none of them had even bothered to consider, was that they hadn't just humiliated an ordinary woman. They had just disrespected Lucille O'Neill. And worse, they had done it right in front of her son. A son who happened to be one of the most recognizable figures in the world. A son who had built an empire rooted in respect, loyalty, and dignity. A son who was now very, very disappointed. Shaq exhaled slowly, his gaze still locked on the dealership floor, where Connor was smiling, laughing, shaking hands with the young couple he had abandoned Lucille for. They were still talking, still engaged in the sale, still completely oblivious to the fact that their entire world was about to shift. Shaq finally moved, slow, controlled. He reached down, picking up his phone, and pressed a single button. The call rang twice before a voice answered. "Yo, what's up, big man?" Shaq's voice was calm, steady. "You still own that news station?" A pause, then a laugh. "You know I do." "Why?" What's on your mind? Shaq's lips curled slightly. I need a favor. Another pause. Then, name it. Shaq's eyes flicked back to Connor. Meet me at Sterling Auto in an hour. Hanging up, Shaq finally stood, stretching to his full height, his presence suddenly impossible to ignore. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, startled. She hadn't even realized he was there. Because no one in this dealership had bothered to pay attention to who was watching. And now, they were about to find out. Because Shaq wasn't just leaving. He wasn't going to let his mother walk away like nothing happened. He was walking straight into the fire. And when he was done, this place would never be the same. Shaquille O'Neal had been quiet all day. Too quiet. And if there was one thing Lucille O'Neal knew about her son, it was that silence was never just silence. Not when it came to him. It meant something was brewing, something heavy, something that wouldn't stay buried for long. They were having dinner at one of Lucille's favorite restaurants, a small soul food spot tucked away in a quiet Atlanta neighborhood. The kind of place where the fried chicken was crispy, the cornbread was warm, and the servers knew your name before you even sat down. Shaq had picked the booth in the corner, the one they always sat in, but tonight he barely touched his plate. And Lucille noticed. She took a slow sip of her tea, setting the cup down before studying her son. You got that look, she said. Shaq lifted an eyebrow. What look? Lucille tilted her head slightly. The look you used to get when kids picked on your little brother. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Ma, I ain't been in a fight since middle school. I didn't say nothing about fighting, Lucille said, narrowing her eyes. I'm talking about that look. The one where you start thinking too much. The one that means you're up to something. Shaq smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ma, he said, leaning back. How long you gonna act like nothing happened today? Lucille froze for half a second, so quick that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Shaq wasn't most people. She exhaled, stirring her tea like it suddenly needed more sugar. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Shaq's smirk widened. Lying ain't your thing, Ma. Lucille sighed, shaking her head. You gonna let me enjoy my meal, or you gonna keep staring at me like that? Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table, his expression turning serious. I saw everything, he said. Lucille finally met his gaze, and just like that, she knew. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lucille let out a small, knowing sigh. You were there. Shaq nodded once. Sat in the VIP lounge the whole time. Lucille set her spoon down, suddenly more tired than hungry. Shaquille, she said. It's not worth making a fuss over. Shaq let out a slow breath, rolling his jaw. You really believe that? He asked, voice low. Lucille gave him a long, measured look. Baby, let me tell you something, she said, her tone calm but firm. This world don't always treat people right. You and I both know that. But I don't lose sleep over every fool that don't know how to act. Shaq stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. That ain't the point, Ma. Then what is? Shaq leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his voice steady. The point is, they didn't know who you were. Lucille blinked. Excuse me. Shaq gestured toward her with one large hand. They didn't know they were talking to Lucille O'Neal. They thought you were just some woman off the street, walking in to waste their time. Lucille's lips pressed into a thin line. And that's supposed to matter? She asked. Shaq's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. It matters because it means they do this to people every day. Lucille went quiet, because he was right. She knew it. She had lived it. But still, she shook her head. I don't need no apology, she said. Shaq smirked. Who said anything about an apology? Lucille squinted at him, recognizing the shift in his tone, that smooth, calculated danger. She set her fork down. What are you up to? Shaq exhaled through his nose, a slow smirk creeping across his face. I'm just thinking, he said, voice smooth. Thinking about how funny it's gonna be when they realize they messed with the wrong woman. Lucille sighed, shaking her head. Shaquille, don't go making a scene. Shaq grinned, raising a hand like he was making a promise. Ma, you know me, he said. I don't make scenes. Lucille gave him a pointed look. You cause hurricanes. Shaq chuckled, finally picking up his fork, but the glint in his eye hadn't faded. Because the storm? It was already moving in. After dinner, Shaq walked Lucille to her car. She slid into the driver's seat, but before she could start the engine, he placed a hand on the door, stopping her. She looked up at him, waiting. You sure you don't want a new car? He asked, his voice softer now. Lucille gave him a small smile. Boy, if I wanted a new car, I'd go buy one myself. Shaq chuckled. Yeah, I know. Lucille tapped her fingers against the steering wheel. Whatever you're planning, she said, make sure you're teaching them something, not just embarrassing them. Shaq nodded slowly, his smirk turning thoughtful. Oh, trust me, he said. They're about to learn a real good lesson. Lucille sighed, starting the engine. Lord help 'em, she muttered. Shaq laughed, stepping back. They gonna need it, he said. As Lucille drove off, Shaq stood in the parking lot for a moment, staring after her car. Then slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name. Then, with one tap, he made the call. The voice on the other end answered immediately. Shaq, what's up, big man? Shaq's smirk returned. How fast can you meet me at Sterling Auto tomorrow? A pause. Then, something go down? Shaq's smirk widened. Yeah, he said, his voice smooth as silk. And I'm about to fix it. The next morning, Sterling Auto Group opened its doors like it was just another day. The sun gleamed off the showroom's polished glass. The luxury cars outside were freshly waxed, and the sales team, well-dressed, well-rehearsed, and always ready to judge a book by its cover, prepared for another round of selling to the right kind of customers. They had no idea that today, everything was about to change. At exactly 10:15 a.m., a black SUV pulled into the lot. It wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, but the moment the driver's door opened, it was impossible to ignore. Shaquille O'Neal stepped out, all 7 feet 1 inch of him, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer, dark jeans, and sleek designer sneakers. He didn't just look like money, he looked like power. And Sterling Auto's sales team noticed immediately. Connor, the same red-haired salesman who had dismissed Lucille the day before, was already moving, practically jogging toward him with a grin so wide it could have been a commercial. Mr. O'Neal, he called out, extending a hand. Welcome to Sterling Auto. What brings you in today? Shaq took the handshake, gripping just tight enough to make Connor feel small. I'm thinking about buying, Shaq said, his deep voice calm, unreadable. Connor's grin widened, his eyes flashing with commission dollar signs. Absolutely, he said, his tone warm, eager, completely different from how he spoke to Lucille. We have the finest selection of luxury vehicles, top-of-the-line models, right this way. Shaq nodded, stepping forward. He let Connor talk. He let him brag about the dealership's exclusivity. He let him explain why only a certain clientele appreciates quality. And the whole time, Shaq was watching how Connor never hesitated to offer him a drink, a VIP tour, a special test drive. Watching how other employees snuck glances, whispering, nodding in approval, because in their eyes he was exactly the kind of buyer they wanted. They were so busy impressing him that they didn't notice the storm behind his smile. Connor led Shaq to the same black luxury SUV Lucille had asked about the day before. This one's a beast, Connor said, tapping the hood like he owned it. Fully loaded, top-of-the-line features. Only the best for a man like yourself. Shaq ran a hand along the side, his fingers tracing the same handle his mother had touched. And the price? He asked smoothly. Connor laughed, waving a hand. Oh, we don't need to talk about that yet. You let me know what you want and we'll make it happen. We take care of our VIPs. Shaq's smile didn't waver. VIPs? He repeated. Connor nodded quickly. Of course. We believe in providing the highest level of service for our top-tier clients. Shaq tilted his head slightly. That right? Absolutely, Connor said. I mean, it's all about knowing who's serious and who's, well, you know. Shaq's gaze hardened just enough. Who's what? Connor hesitated, A fraction of a second too long. Shaq caught it. And then? Shaq went in for the kill. "Let me ask you something," Shaq said, crossing his arms. Connor perked up, still completely unaware of the trap he was walking into. "Of course. Anything, Mr. O'Neill." Shaq's expression stayed smooth, unreadable. "How do y'all decide which customers get the VIP treatment?" Connor blinked. "Excuse me?" Shaq kept his stance casual, but his words were razor sharp. "I mean, yesterday I saw a lady walk in here. She asked about this same SUV." Connor's smile faltered just slightly. Shaq didn't let up. "But she didn't get champagne. She didn't get a VIP tour. She didn't get you rushing over with a handshake." Connor swallowed. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "Why do you think that is?" Silence. For the first time all morning, Connor had no words. Shaq let the moment stretch, let the weight of the question sink in. Then, he took another step forward, his presence towering, undeniable. "You know what's funny?" Shaq said, his tone almost amused. Connor swallowed again. "What's that?" Shaq smiled. "The woman you ignored yesterday? The one you walked away from? The one your boys laughed at?" Connor froze. Shaq's smile widened. "That was my mother." Everything stopped. The color drained from Connor's face so fast, it looked like he might pass out. The showroom, once buzzing with conversation, felt too quiet, as if the entire dealership had been sucked into some kind of vacuum of realization. Connor's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Mr. O'Neill, I had no idea." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah," he said. "That's the problem." Connor fumbled for words, his hands twitching. "If we had known, if we realized, of course we would have." Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off. "You mean," he said, "if you had known she was connected to me, you would have treated her differently?" Connor went silent. Because there was no good answer. Because anything he said now would only prove the point. And Shaq knew it. The dealership owner, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, had appeared near the entrance, looking confused and nervous. Shaq saw him but didn't acknowledge him. This wasn't about the higher-ups. This was about the people who worked the floor, the people who decided every single day who deserved respect and who didn't. Shaq exhaled slowly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Tell you what," he said, tilting the screen toward Connor. It was a recording. A clip of the dealership's showroom from the day before. A clip that showed Connor walking away from Lucille. The laughter. The dismissive treatment. All of it. Connor's eyes widened in horror. Shaq smirked. "See, I could post this," he said. "Let the world see how y'all do business." Connor's breath hitched. "Please, Mr. O'Neill, But I'm not going to do that," Shaq interrupted. Connor's shoulders sagged in relief, until Shaq's expression turned cold. "Because I'm going to give you the chance to fix it yourself." Shaq turned to the dealership owner, locking eyes with him. "You're going to put new policies in place," Shaq said, his voice smooth, controlled. "You're going to train your staff to treat every customer the way you treated me today." The owner nodded furiously. "Of course, absolutely, And," Shaq continued, "you're going to have my mother come back here, not to apologize, but to personally see that y'all did it." The owner swallowed hard, nodding. Shaq turned back to Connor. "And you?" he said. Connor's hands were shaking now. Shaq's voice dropped lower. "You're gonna remember this moment every time you decide who deserves your respect." Connor nodded quickly, his face red, humiliated, exposed. Shaq smiled, slow, deliberate. Then, with one final glance around the silent, stunned showroom, he slipped his sunglasses back on. And as he walked out, he didn't need to say anything else. Because of the lesson? Had already learned. The air inside Sterling Auto Group had changed. A moment ago, the showroom was filled with the polished confidence of luxury salespeople, eager to impress. Now the walls seemed too tight, the lighting too harsh, the weight of one realization crushing everyone in the room. And at the center of it all, Shaquille O'Neal. Standing tall, calm, and completely in control. Connor hadn't moved. The red-haired salesman, who had been all smiles and smooth pitches just moments ago, now stood frozen in place, his face pale, his breath shallow. Because the words Shaq had just spoken, they had changed everything. The woman you ignored yesterday, the one you walked away from, the one your people laughed at? Shaq's voice had been calm, even measured, but the weight behind it was crushing. That was my mother. And with that single sentence, the entire dealership fell into dead silence. Connor's mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands twitched at his sides, like he was reaching for an explanation that didn't exist. Behind him, the other employees were just as stunned, staring, blinking, processing the fact that they had humiliated the wrong woman. And worse, they had done it in front of the one man who could make sure they never forgot it. The showroom's quiet hum of business had stopped completely. Customers, once busy admiring sleek cars and discussing financing options, were now whispering among themselves. They had no idea they were walking into this moment, this reckoning, this exposure of bias that had been happening in plain sight. And now, they were watching the truth unfold in real time. Connor finally found his voice, but it was weak, stumbling, broken. "Mr. O'Neill, I swear I didn't know." Shaq lifted a hand. The motion was slow, deliberate, not aggressive, not threatening, but impossibly powerful. Connor's words died in his throat. Because he knew. Shaq wasn't here for excuses. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of their own actions settle in. Then, with a chilling calm, he spoke. "So, tell me something." Connor swallowed hard, his entire body locked in place. Shaq's deep voice cut through the room like a blade. "If she had been anybody else, if she had been just another woman you didn't recognize, would you have treated her any different?" The silence was unbearable. Connor's face twisted, struggling to find an answer that wouldn't damn him further. Shaq waited. No one dared to speak. And then, it hit Connor all at once. There was no way out of this. Because no matter what he said, the truth was already laid bare. And Shaq? He just stood there, letting him drown in it. Across the showroom, a woman in a designer dress leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Did that salesman really just ignore Shaq's mother?" A younger man near the entrance pulled out his phone, silently recording the moment. And the receptionist? The one who had barely looked at Lucille the day before? She stared down at her desk, her hands gripping the edges like she could disappear into them. Because they all knew. They had all let it happen. The dealership manager appeared, clearly having heard the commotion. A tall man in a navy blue suit. His face was tight with forced control, his posture stiff as he approached. "Mr. O'Neill, I deeply apologize if there was any misunderstanding," he started. Shaq turned his head, staring him down so effortlessly that the manager physically shifted back. Shaq let out a low chuckle. "Misunderstanding," he repeated. The manager didn't respond, because they both knew better. Shaq turned back to Connor, his expression unreadable. "Tell me something," he said. Connor flinched, slightly. Yes, sir?" Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "If I had walked in here yesterday, instead of my mother, how would you have treated me?" Connor knew the answer. Everyone in that showroom knew the answer. And that was the real problem. Shaq inhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You see, that's the thing about respect," he said. "You don't give it because someone's famous, or because they're rich, or because they might cost you your job." He leaned in slightly. "You give it because it's the right thing to do." Connor nodded quickly, his face flushed, humiliated, exposed. Yes, sir, I understand." Shaq's voice dropped even lower. "Do you?" Connor opened his mouth to respond, but Shaq wasn't waiting for an answer. He turned to the manager, his voice smooth but firm. "This ain't just about one person," he said. "It's about your whole business." The manager nodded so fast it was almost pathetic. "We will absolutely be addressing this issue." Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off. "You're gonna do more than address it," he said. The manager swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. O'Neill." Shaq's expression stayed calm, composed, but unshakable. "I'm gonna send my mother back here next week," he said. Not for an apology, but to make sure y'all actually changed. The manager nodded again, glancing toward Connor, who was standing there like a man whose career had just imploded. And it had, because he would never be able to sell another car without remembering this day. Shaq exhaled, finally stepping back. And as he did, the entire showroom felt smaller. Connor stood there, staring at the floor, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The manager was already frantically making notes, thinking of PR damage control. And the rest of the dealership? They were still in stunned silence, still reeling from the realization that today, they got caught. Shaq didn't need to say anything else. He had already said enough. So, with a final glance around, he slipped on his sunglasses, exuding unshakable presence, and turned toward the exit. He could feel every pair of eyes in the building on his back as he walked through the glass doors, stepping into the sunlight like he had just rewritten the rules of this place. And as he left, one thought ran through his mind. They'll never make that mistake again. Connor still hadn't moved. His face was pale, his breathing uneven, his entire body locked in place, as if somehow standing still might make this all go away. It wouldn't. Not today. Not after this. Because when Shaquille O'Neal speaks, people listen. And right now, the whole room was listening. The dealership manager was already scrambling. "Mr. O'Neal, we truly regret this misunderstanding," he said, forcing a tight, nervous smile. "If there's anything we can do, perhaps a discount, a special offer." Shaq turned his head just slightly. The movement was slow, controlled, but the weight behind it, crushing. He raised an eyebrow. "A discount?" The manager swallowed hard. Shaq let the word hang in the air, letting the absurdity of it sink in. "You think money is the problem here?" The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. Shaq let out a short, humorless laugh. "You don't fix character with a price cut." Connor flinched, because he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. Much, much bigger. Shaq pulled out his phone. The room tensed. Connor's breath hitched. If he thought Shaq was about to post the video clip, the one showing everything, his career was already over. But Shaq wasn't playing for clicks. He was playing for change. So instead, he dialed a number. The phone rang once, twice. Then, "Shaq?" A deep voice answered on the other end. Shaq's smirk was slow, deliberate. "Yeah," he said, his voice smooth. "We got a situation at Sterling Auto. You might want to come down here." A pause. Then, "I'm on my way." Click. Shaq put his phone back in his pocket. And now? Now they waited. 15 minutes later, the glass doors swung open, and a tall man in a charcoal suit strode inside. The dealership owner, Jonathan Sterling himself. He was older, sharp-eyed, and looked like the kind of man who built his empire on knowing everything happening under his roof. And right now, he was furious. Not at Shaq. At his own people. "Shaq," he greeted, his voice steady. "I came as soon as I got your call." Shaq nodded once, then leaned against a nearby desk, arms crossed over his massive chest. "Appreciate it," he said. Then, with a glance toward Connor and the manager, he added, "We got some things to talk about." For the next 10 minutes, Jonathan Sterling listened. Listened as Shaq laid out exactly what happened. Listened as the truth unraveled like a slow-burning disaster. Listened as his employees fidgeted, paled, and ran out of excuses. And when Shaq was done, the entire showroom was holding its breath. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his hands resting on his hips. "Is this true?" he asked, turning toward Connor. Connor stared at the floor. "Look at me when I ask you a question," Jonathan said, his voice low, cutting. Connor lifted his eyes, his face a mix of shame and regret. "Yes, sir," he admitted. "It's true." The words landed like a weight on his chest, because it was one thing to get caught, another thing to say it out loud, to admit what he had done, to face it. And now, there was no turning back. Jonathan turned toward Shaq. "You know this isn't how we do business," he said. "You know this isn't..." Shaq held up a hand, stopping him. "You want to fix this?" he asked. Jonathan nodded without hesitation. Then here's what you're gonna do, Shaq said, his voice smooth but undeniable. You're gonna put real policies in place, not just an apology, not just some PR stunt. Jonathan nodded again. Done. Shaq tilted his head slightly. And you're gonna have my mother come back here next week, he continued. Not for an apology, but to see that y'all actually changed something. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he nodded again. Understood. Shaq leaned in slightly. And one more thing. Jonathan braced himself. Shaq's next words landed like a hammer. You're gonna make sure this doesn't just stop here. Jonathan exhaled through his nose. What do you mean? Shaq's expression didn't change. I mean, you're gonna call your people, he said. Other dealerships, other businesses. You're gonna make sure they learn from your mistake before they make their own. And that was how it started. The moment it stopped being about one incident. The moment it turned into a movement. Because in the days that followed, Jonathan Sterling made the calls. Other dealerships started changing policies, training employees, setting new standards, making sure their businesses weren't next in line to get exposed. News outlets picked up the story, headlines reading, Shaquille O'Neal calls out bias in high-end retail. How many others have been turned away? Respect shouldn't have a price tag. And across social media, customers shared their own experiences. Stories flooded in. People who had been judged before they even spoke. People who had been ignored because of what they wore, what they drove, how they looked. And suddenly, this wasn't just about Lucille O'Neal. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they weren't worth the time. As for Connor, he lost more than just a potential sale that day. He lost his credibility. Because no matter what happened next, no matter where he worked, he would always remember the day Shaquille O'Neal asked him one simple question. Would you have treated her differently if she wasn't my mother? And the answer would haunt him forever. A week later, Lucille O'Neal stepped back into Sterling Auto Group. Not as a customer seeking approval, but as a woman standing tall in a space that had once dismissed her. The sales team stood straighter. The receptionist greeted her warmly. And Jonathan Sterling himself walked her through every change they had made. Lucille listened, watched, and finally, she smiled, not because they had apologized, but because they had learned. Because real power isn't about making people pay, it's about making them change. And that was a lesson they would never forget. For most businesses, a scandal like this would have been just another PR nightmare, something to smooth over, apologize for, and move past quietly. But for Sterling Auto Group, there was no moving past this. Because Shaquille O'Neal didn't let them. And because the world had already seen the truth. A month after the incident, Sterling Auto looked different. Not on the surface. The showroom was still polished, the luxury cars still gleamed under bright lights, and the scent of fresh leather still filled the air. But the energy inside had shifted. Salesmen were no longer picking and choosing who to greet first. Customers, regardless of their clothes, their cars, or their assumed bank accounts, were treated with the same level of respect. Diversity and sensitivity training was no longer a one-time seminar. It was policy. And Connor? He was gone. Jonathan Sterling had made it clear. A business can't afford employees who only know how to act right when the cameras are rolling. But the change didn't stop at Sterling Auto. Because once Shaq had put the pressure on, other dealerships took notice. No one wanted to be the next place exposed for discrimination. And so, one by one, they updated policies, trained staff, and took real steps to ensure every customer, no matter their background, was given the respect they deserved. The movement had begun, and it wasn't slowing down. For Shaq, this wasn't about one dealership. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something bigger. So he took the moment and turned it into a mission. He launched a nationwide initiative, partnering with major brands to push for equity and customer service. He funded scholarships for young Black entrepreneurs looking to start their own luxury businesses. He started a series of community talks, using his platform to highlight racial and class bias in everyday spaces. Because money doesn't change reality. Power does. And Shaq? He had plenty of both. A few weeks later, Shaq sat with his mother on her back porch, the evening air warm. The hum of cicadas filling the space between them. Lucille sipped her tea slowly, watching the sunset. You made quite the mess, you know that? She said, her voice filled with amusement. Shaq chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, I know. Lucille shook her head. You really didn't have to do all that for me. Shaq turned his head, meeting her gaze. Ma, he said, his voice quieter now. This wasn't just about you. Lucille studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. I know, she said. Because she did. She had lived through enough to understand. This wasn't just about one bad experience in a dealership. It was about the thousands of times people like her were dismissed, ignored, pushed aside, just because they didn't look like they belonged. And maybe Shaq couldn't fix every injustice, but he could sure as hell make sure this one didn't happen again. Lucille set her cup down, folding her hands in her lap. You know, she said, her voice soft but firm, the people in that dealership, they built their whole world thinking folks like me are supposed to stay small. Shaq exhaled slowly, nodding. Lucille smiled. But the thing about respect, she said, tilting her head slightly. You can't take it from someone who never needed your approval in the first place. Shaq let the words sink in. Then, slowly, he smiled. Because his mother? She had already won. And now? So had countless others. The world would move on to the next big thing. The headlines would fade. But what happened inside that dealership? That would never be forgotten. Because this wasn't about cars. It wasn't about money. It was about something bigger than all of that. It was about dignity. And dignity? That's something no one can put a price tag on. Respect isn't a privilege. It's a right. How many times has this happened when no one was watching? Change starts when people stop staying silent. The next time you see it happening, what will you do?